here. Awesome. So we are recording this action hour, just for everyone to know. But hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the Rumors versus Reality Offshore Wind Action Hour. I am Juliana LaRue, the Climate Policy and Outreach Coordinator at the League of Conservation Voters. If you don't know, the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters is a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit working to advocate for the environment and to make Connecticut a greener, healthier state. Today, we will aim to provide clarity and evidence-based insights on offshore wind. Our expert panelists will offer information on various aspects, including the political landscape surrounding offshore wind, accurate information about its impact on marine life, and the latest updates on Connecticut's offshore wind initiatives. First, you will hear from Charles Rothenberger, the climate and energy attorney from Save the Sound. Then you will hear from Captain Paul Edmond, a member of the Windworks Coalition, a fly/light fishing guide, and a marine fish conservation advocate. And then you'll hear from Allison McLeod, who is the state policy director with New Jersey LCV. So Q&A will be through the chat. So if you have any questions, just put your questions in there. And at the end, I will facilitate them and make sure that your questions are answered. So first, I want to hand it over to Charles, and then we're going to go to Paul and then Allison. So Charles, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Juliana. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see everybody who's attending. I'm going to start by demonstrating my horrible Zoom skills and attempt to share my screen. Yes, to hopefully provide you with a map. There we go, of where the offshore wind lease areas are. I think that's a common question when we're talking about offshore wind. Well, where are these located? I would caution you not to pay particular attention to the names of the projects associated with these, since this map is a little bit out of date and the projects have changed. But the lease areas remain. So those color-coded shaded areas that you see are the offshore wind lease areas that the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management has been leasing to project developers. The different colors represent different development interests. And as you can see, they're all located and arrayed roughly along the outer continental shelf of the United States. So we're talking anywhere from 12 to 20 miles offshore for the most part. Really very little in terms of visual impacts. And having taken a trip out to some of these lease areas, they really are quite a ways out there. I also wanted to note, since we are here in Connecticut, the absence of any lease areas in Long Island Sound. These projects are really being proposed and developed where the wind is. Because of its geography, there is very little wind potential in Long Island Sound. So I think we need not worry about that. One of the aspects of projects that may, however, impact Long Island Sound is when it comes to transmission cables. So there's really three main parts when we're talking about offshore wind. The turbines themselves, which is what you typically think of, the tall towers with the blades attached at the central nacelle, which spins to generate the electricity. Each of those turbines, and there could be as many as 88, depending upon the size of the wind farm, are then attached to an offshore substation. Substation on a raised platform by individual array cables. That offshore platform steps up the voltage so it can then be transmitted to shore along the export cables. And usually a project will have one or two export cables running from the offshore substation to land, where the voltage is then regulated again before it's being transmitted to all of our homes at an onshore substation. So that's sort of the, I guess, the landscape. And I will well, I will leave that up there for now since it may be a useful graphic. In the United States, we have a goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and establishing a pathway to deploy 110 gigawatts or more by 2050. So far, BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has approved 9 projects throughout the country, totaling 13 gigawatts, or roughly enough to power 5 million homes. And here in the Northeast, we've really been in the pole position when it comes to developing these offshore wind resources. You can see we have a large number of lease areas, and the states have all set individual procurement targets in this area. We have an ongoing current procurement for offshore wind resources in combination with Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We've put out to bid in Connecticut 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. Massachusetts solicitation is for 3,600 megawatts. And Rhode Island is looking for 1,200 megawatts. So all in, about 6,000 megawatts up for grabs in this latest solicitation. And there are several projects that have bid into that process. To date, Connecticut has one project that is not quite up and running yet, but it has begun construction. A lot of the staging work is happening in New London, Connecticut. If you drive past New London, you'll see the towers and the blades and the nacelles being prepared to be shipped off to the lease site for installation. That project, Revolution Wind, you can see on the map, that is accurate. It's a 704 megawatt project split between Connecticut and Rhode Island. Steel is going in the water as we speak, although there has been a slight delay when it comes to turning the switch and getting the power from that. Has nothing to do with the wind turbines themselves, but it was discovered that at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where the offshore substation is being staged, there are some contamination issues with that site. So as a result of the need for remediation there, the project has been pushed back about a year. So expect turning the power on there 2026 from 2025. And the industry is certainly experiencing some growing pains. I'm sure everybody has heard about the blade failure for the Vineyard Wind project. That's a Massachusetts offshore wind project where a turbine blade broke off and shattered, and recovery efforts are ongoing. That has put a hold on that project, and that's the 800 megawatt project that you can see on the map there. So it was partially constructed. The installation work has stopped. There is no power being generated from that project. And there is an investigation going on in terms of the cause of that blade failure. There have been some concerns about GE manufactured blades before, and this was a GE blade. So I'm not sure what the cause is. It seems like it was an installation issue rather than a manufacturing issue, but time will tell when we see that report. That being said, we shouldn't let that suggest that these projects are not moving forward. Here in Connecticut, we had a couple of projects, the Park City Wind Project, which was proposed to be staged in Bridgeport, which because of certain inflationary pressures, many of the offshore wind projects in the early stages of development found that they were no longer cost effective at the originally bid prices. So after trying to negotiate with the states, there was also a project in Massachusetts in the same position. Park City Wind and the Massachusetts project Commonwealth Wind ended their power purchase agreements with the states, basically terminated the contracts. They each paid a penalty to those states. Here in Connecticut, Park City Wind paid $36 million to the state of Connecticut, which was deposited in our energy efficiency fund to help bolster that program. So there was a benefit that accrued as a result of that termination. And both of those projects are rebidding into this most current solicitation. So in the meantime, what happened is that BOEM continued with its process of project review. Projects continue to be analyzed for their environmental impact, adjustments made, and projects approved moving forward. So even though a project doesn't have quote unquote live contract or power purchase agreement, that doesn't mean it's not continuing to secure the necessary permits and approvals that it needs. And here in the Northeast, so far, 9 projects, well, no, how many projects have been approved here? 5 gigawatts of capacity has been approved so far for New England. So I mentioned that 30 gigawatt goal nationwide. We may be able to secure 5 gigawatts if all of the contracts are put in place. So Connecticut is certainly doing its share in terms of moving these projects forward. Right now, I think what everybody is waiting for is the result of the solicitations. Nobody really knows what prices have been bid for these projects. That's obviously a big concern here in Connecticut as we are feeling the impacts of the latest rate hike, which ironically is the result of a contract that was signed with Millstone back in 2017. So has nothing to do with clean renewable energy. That's really being driven primarily by the Millstone issue, as well as some defaults related to the COVID pandemic. But be that as it may, you all see the newspaper, so you know the public temperature. So you know, we are hoping that these projects come in at a cost competitive price so that we can continue to move forward. As I mentioned, permits are in hand, so they are ready to be to start the process of construction. And I should note for our Connecticut audience, even though to date, none of these projects have had interconnections in Connecticut, moving forward, we do anticipate that some of them may. The Vineyard Wind 2 project, which is part of the current solicitation, 1,200 megawatts, has proposed an interconnection at the old, well, I guess not quite old, the long-standing Montville station in Montville, Connecticut. So that's an existing power plant and can easily interconnect. Another site in Connecticut that has been looked at as a good interconnection site for these projects is the Millstone site, since it has the transmission infrastructure in place. And I will end with noting that so far to date, there's really only been one project that has had any connection whatsoever to Long Island Sound. And that was a New York offshore wind proposal called Beacon Wind. Not sure if that is on this map or not, but be that as it may, the export cable for that project, the cable that runs from the offshore substation to the onshore substation, was proposed to run the length of Long Island Sound, just the other side of the Connecticut-New York border. And there is existing energy infrastructure in Long Island Sound as well. We have the Connecticut Blue Plan, which sort of is a zoning plan for Long Island Sound when it comes to energy projects. So they all need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. But so far, that's been the only project that's proposed anything for Long Island Sound. And that is one of the few projects that have been proposed that is on hold. It was also facing those same inflationary pressures, and the developer of that project decided to put everything on hold. They're not pursuing any permits at this time, although we anticipate once they do some more thinking about the project, it will be coming back in some form or another. But I think I am almost at time, so I might leave it there and save more time for questions at the end. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Charles, so much. And again, if you have questions, send them through the chat. You can stop sharing your screen and then I will.
You're very confident in my abilities.
Here, I can stop it for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
There you go. Everyone can see my screen, I'm assuming. And we're gonna go over to Captain Paul Edmond. I'm going to be sharing my screen with his slides, and we're going to go along that way. But thank you, Charles, and Captain Paul. It's your time to shine here. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Hi there. As I was introduced in the beginning, I'm a fisherman from New Jersey. I grew up on Long Island. So this whole area of the New York Bight is really, it's my home. It's my home waters. And I'm kind of a unique fisherman, whereas I'm not only a recreational fisherman, but I'm also a conservation advocate. And I've been working in this space for the past 30 years, from everything from marine habitat to menhaden, which we call bunker around here, or pogies up in New England. But I bring that up because it all relates to everything we're talking about here. So I just wanted to go over a couple of slides and let's have some fun. So first and foremost, I'd like to talk about the myth that, when we install the offshore wind, it's going to be detrimental to both recreational and commercial fishing. And while that may be slightly true for commercial fishermen that are towing mobile gear, meaning people that are fishing for squid with large nets or clams on the bottom or scallops, they clearly have from the beginning made it very well known that they do not want the steel in the water because it's pretty much in the way of trawling and dragging equipment along the bottom. So they've been the force behind anti-wind from the very beginning. So I do feel, after learning all about offshore wind for the past decade or so, that offshore wind can coexist with commercial and recreational fishing. I believe that the damages from climate change alone will cause far greater impact to our fishing than offshore wind ever will or could. Putting an end to the burning of fossil fuels will clearly give us cleaner air and water, and it will help our ocean drastically. Right here, like for example, in New Jersey, we have a wind farm by Atlantic Shores. We're talking about powering 650,000 homes right off the bat that would normally be powered by more polluting methods. So that's something to keep in mind. The picture that you see on the left is a fishing trip that we took up to the Block Island wind farm, which was a prototype of the wind farms to come. And the prototype has proven to be really, really valuable in many ways. The offshore wind industry has learned from that experience in terms of burying cables, foundation construction, you name it. And I'm holding there in the picture, I have a couple of black sea bass that we caught at the base of the turbines. And black sea bass will be a prevalent species. They're also very popular, very sustainable, and really good to eat. So there's no doubt in my mind that once the wind farms are put up, people will be eating a lot more black sea bass. And commercial interests are also going to benefit from that because they can set their gear at the bases of these turbines. I guess it's also important to mention that at the bottom of each of the turbines is a foundation. Okay, now unlike the foundations seen up in Block Island, which are a four-post bar stool type of foundation, most of the other ones that are planned are what we call monopiles, which is a rather large steel tube that gets pile driven into the seafloor, and then at the base of that they put a 90-foot ring of granite or rock, and that becomes the substrate for what will soon become an artificial reef. And those artificial reefs will increase biodiversity along our coast, therefore increasing the quality of fishing and also giving people a very, very visible from out on the water. You know exactly where you want to fish, and if you're not catching fish on one, you could pilot your boat a mile and get on the next one. And we totally envision that different piles are going to have different types of fish depending on the bottom. It's just a very exciting prospect. So you're going to have, like we've already seen up in Point Judith, we have charter boats heading out to sea, fishing directly on top of these turbines, and it's just fantastic for fluke, for bluefish, for black sea bass, for tog, or as you guys up there call them, blackfish. The fishing for benthic and other species, even mahi-mahi around the turbines is fantastic. Next slide, please. The next myth I'd like to address was one from the very start. So back in, I guess it was December of 2022, we had a humpback whale wash up in New Jersey, and then another 7 washed up in a very, very short amount of time. And so a rumor was started online that said that the offshore wind sonar vessels were actually killing the whales. And this slide, if you look carefully at it, the one on the left is actually a sonar ship that uses sonar to look down about 150 to 350 feet down below the seabed. It doesn't need to go any deeper than that because the monopiles are only going in to about 200 feet or so. But you can see, now this is the same type of sonar that I've had on my boat. It's the same type of sonar that everybody uses on the water, and it's harmless. It is not causing any harm to marine mammals or fish. The picture on the right, which is where we believe the rumor started, was making the comparison between sonar mapping and a method used for finding oil and gas deposits 6 miles down below the seafloor, which is actually extremely harmful to marine mammals. And this is an explosive type of seismic air gun that sends these jets down. And in the past, I've been involved in campaigns against offshore drilling, and this was the #1 concern. It wasn't so much the drilling, it was the testing and the exploration methods used, which are in fact extremely harmful. So it's apples and orange comparison. And unfortunately, in these days where everybody only reads headlines, it really took on a whole nother meaning, and there's simply not much truth to that. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another one of my all-time favorite subjects. When I first got into offshore wind, there was a rumor going around that the cables from the offshore wind would scare away all the fish, it would hurt the whales and dolphins, and all of our marine life would basically scatter and leave the area. The reality is that a lot of this started because of the comparison between high tension lines on land and submarine cables. So once again, we have this social media effect where people see a rumor, and especially if they are against renewable energy and or the current administration, they were using these different issues like the dead whales and like the EMFs and the anti-fishing to shall we say, weaponize offshore wind. And it's simply not factually correct. So when we're talking about electromagnetic fields from high tension wires, we were always told that there's a cancer risk, you don't want to buy a house, there's childhood leukemia, and this really put the fear of God in everybody. And that fear is now being used with the submarine cables. What's fascinating to me with the submarine cables is that these things are extremely expensive. They are triple wound and self EMF canceling. They are encased in plastic and lead. You can see a cutaway view there on the slide. and they are insulated. And not only that, but they're buried 6 feet under the seabed. So any EMFs are barely detectable. And in Europe, what they do is they do cable inspection. In Europe, there've been offshore wind farms for the past 25, 30 years. So they've pretty much experienced all this, and they have yet to see any type of EMF blockage or decrease in migration or any effect. What they have noticed, though, from like underwater submarines that do the cable inspections, is that certain species that rely on electrical sensory organs within their body for motivation and navigation through the water, is that they do sense it, but they don't avoid it. They may swim a little higher over the cable, but you have species like lobsters, which are highly sensitive to this. They're building their homes right on top of these cable runs. So to me, that tells me that, you know, all this hype about EMFs is just that. It's another tool in the anti-wind toolbox that they seek, and it's just simply not true. It's really been exaggerated, and a lot of creatures have been living in or on top of the submarine cables in Europe for well over 25 years. And I know I only used 10 minutes of my time, but I look forward to the question and answer. If you have any questions at all about whales and other marine life, this slide that's up now is fascinating to me because it kind of touches upon several areas of my world. So the first and foremost area is this is what we call the New York Bight. So it's pretty much an area from the tip of Montauk down to Cape May, New Jersey. And it's like a big triangle, okay? All those lines represent inbound and outbound container ship traffic. All the red dots indicate the spots where humpback whales have been seen lunge feeding in the last 10 years. You could see how the ships directly overlap. And unfortunately, in that same time period that I mentioned earlier about the whales washing up, this was directly after the pandemic, okay, when we had a severe deficit in shipping traffic. So in an effort to catch up, many more ships came through, and it's definitely that they hit the whales, and then the whales proceeded to wash up on the shores along Jersey and New York. And you can go on New York and New Jersey Port Authority. You can look at the container loads. You can see the graphs because they keep very accurate records of the shipping traffic, and you can see how the increase directly correlates to the deaths of these whales. And I'm sure our next speaker will touch upon that. Thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And if, again, questions, add them in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. I'm going to hand it over to Allison, and we'll get into questions after your presentation.
Hi, thanks so much. And thanks to our previous speakers, and thanks to the folks at Connecticut LCV for having us. My name is Allison McLeod. I am the Senior Public Policy Director here at the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, so a sister group. And I'm going to be talking, to follow on what Captain Paul said about some of our experiences in New Jersey, and specifically with a misinformation campaign that we saw about offshore wind with the whale strandings. And so I do want to apologize. I got a note that my internet's a little unstable. So if I freeze or cut out, it just let me know in the chat or something, and I'll try turning my camera off. So addressing the whale in the room is the misinformation campaign around offshore wind. Okay, so in early around 2022, as Captain Paul said, we started seeing that we had a problem. We were seeing an unusual mortality event, specifically of humpback whales, but also of some smaller marine mammal species, dolphins, porpoises. And it was coinciding with discussion about exploration activity for offshore wind in these areas of New Jersey, some of the lease areas that Charles had referenced. And so as an environmental organization that's focused on combating climate change and focusing on a shift to clean renewable energy, we've been supportive, New Jersey LCV, of sustainable, responsibly developed offshore wind. And so at first we thought, well, is there any kind of link? And just a little bit of research said, no, there is not. The unusual mortality event of humpback whales began in 2016, which is well before there was any exploration activity. When you saw the stranding events, they did not coincide at the same time that there were boats in the water. There are in these lease areas right now, a lot of it was pre-work. There are no turbines in the water in these areas. So people are saying the turbines are killing the whales. That wasn't possible because there are no turbines in most of these areas. And so now that we were confident that there was no evidence at all, what do we do about it? And how do we make sure that environmental activists and that our members and followers, decision makers, elected officials, how do we make sure that they have this information? And on top of that, where was this all coming from? Where did this story come from? If the unusual mortality event began in 2016, why are we just hearing about it now? And so I'm going to talk a little bit almost like a case study about what happened in New Jersey. So like I said, the first thing that we wanted to do was get the facts. And so we looked at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who I said has been tracking a UME from Maine to Florida of unusual mortality in these marine species. And as you can see, the numbers in New Jersey are not that different from numbers in surrounding states. In some places, other states are worse. It varied from year to year. 2022 was the year that we had started seeing this. And you'll see that in other years, it had been worse. So we hadn't heard about this before. We relied a lot on the data from necropsies, which are, when it's possible after a stranding event that results in a fatality, to do basically an animal autopsy and necropsy from the Marine Mammal Stranding Center. They did full necropsies, and what we kept seeing was entanglements from abandoned fishing gear or ghost gear, and there were some bacterial infections, but also vessel strikes, as Captain Paul had talked about. So we weren't seeing anything that had to do with, any kind of offshore wind development. It was primarily vessel strikes. And as Captain Paul said, there are a lot of records. So we could see when offshore wind vessels are in the water and when there were vessel strikes. Now, it became relevant that my personal background, I worked in the Gulf of Mexico in the early, mid 2010s as a protected species observer, a marine mammal observer, and a passive acoustic monitor. So all of these projects that are working in lease areas under the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which Charles talked about earlier, they're required to have protected species observers on board. And what they do is they enforce the provisions of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so they are functionally whale watchers. And so you're looking for whales, and they have permit conditions to protect those species. So if there were any kind of injuries, they would have to report them. It's not like, something that you could just hide. So I worked as a PSO, protected species observer, and my background is actually, my degree is in marine biology. And I worked with marine mammals, and I thought that was a very niche experience that would never be relevant again. And suddenly, I was talking about my work here all the time. So we'll get back to kind of that. I'm just kind of doing a lay of the land right now. But very, very quickly, this issue became extremely political for people who were opposed to offshore wind, as Captain Paul said. So we started seeing, unfortunately, political party ads, save the whales, stop offshore wind, it's killing whales, even though we knew that it wasn't. So one of the first things that people would always ask us is, okay, well, if it's not offshore wind, what is killing the whales? And it's, as most answers, it's complicated. And so from a messaging perspective, we were kind of combating that. It's a very simple message to say offshore wind kills whales. It doesn't matter that it's not true, because it took off like wildfire. So what is killing it? As Captain Paul said, there's vessel strikes. We know that there is a huge increase in shipping just post-pandemic and how we purchase things. We all buy online. The Port of New York and New Jersey is one of, if not the, at times, busiest container port in the United States. Particularly, there was a period of time when the Port of Los Angeles shut down and everything was rerouted through the Port of New York and New Jersey. So at the same time, he mentioned bunker. There's been a multi-state effort a few years ago to protect bunker populations, which are humpback whale prey. So we have more fish, which led to more whales in shipping lanes. So you've got more traffic, more whales. There were more collisions, unfortunately. And what we faced was there were people who had genuine questions about offshore wind, people who were supportive of clean energy, supportive of offshore wind, who said, is it killing whales? And those were really the people that we wanted to talk to. There are people who, are spreading misinformation, who believe it. There are people who are never going to hear the evidence that there's no causal relation. We're not going to win them over, but we wanted to talk to the people who had genuine questions and make sure that they had the facts. It was an election year for the 2023 was the entire New Jersey legislature was up, and this was a hot button issue. And so opposition was really spending dollars on it. We knew that we needed to talk to our elected officials. We needed to talk to our constituents, our supporters. We needed to get the correct information out there. And so how did we do that? So this is a very grainy, because it's an old picture of me on a vessel in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see my little binoculars there doing some whale watching. We needed to educate folks. And so we started meeting with legislators who were environmental champions and giving them the facts. We shared with them the charts that we had already had, the data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the results of the net CropSeas. We shared with them what the permit conditions require for offshore wind, that they're not allowed to just go out there. We shared with them some of the sonar information, the shipping information, things that Captain Paul went over. We shared that with every legislator, excuse me. And then we had key targeted meetings where we just answered their questions, because we know they were getting call after call from constituents in a very targeted misinformation campaign effort. And the same thing with our members. We wanted to do webinars like these to share information with people so that they had their questions answered about sonar or about transmission lines and the effects that they may or may not be having. We also identified key partners and trusted voices. We worked very closely with Greenpeace. They are obviously noted whale champions. And so Greenpeace actually joined us for a lot of these webinars, because they, agreed that the single largest threat to our marine ecosystems is climate change. And offshore wind is one tool in the toolbox to help us transition to a just clean energy future and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And so folks like Greenpeace, we had faith leaders, we worked with folks who are other like smaller environmental commission groups. We worked with the state groups that organize environmental commissions to get to those environmental supporters to make sure that they understood this misinformation. And we also, worked with animal rights groups to make sure that they understood too that, we as New Jersey LCV, we absolutely support protecting our marine life, and we would not support an industry that was just killing whales indiscriminately. That was not happening though, and so we needed to make sure everyone understood that. For me, on a personal note, my background is in marine biology. I did this. So it is a personal and professional issue. If anybody loves the whales, it's me. I lived on boats for, months at a time protecting whales. So I wouldn't support an industry that, was causing these strandings. So in addition to doing that targeted outreach to our stakeholders, our legislators, elected officials, constituents, we also wanted to have a larger media strategy. And so we held a press conference. There's Captain Paul and some other partners with us, some of those partners that I mentioned, in Atlantic City, which is a place where there are turbines that are very near shore, but it's one of the areas that is part of the lease projects coming in the future. And so we shared all of this information with the media. This became not only a local story, it went national and then international. I was on German radio talking about it. I became what I affectionately called the whale woman of the Jersey Shore. Hundreds of media stories about this, because people really care, right? People really care about their marine life, as they should, and we do as well. And we want to protect our whales and dolphins, which is why, we're trying to combat climate change, frankly. And so we started with, a press conference to kick off this media strategy, did a lot of interviews. We had folks from a coalition that we work with called New Jersey Windworks, which is all, promoting responsibly developed offshore wind. Captain Paul's part of that, the environmental commissions folks, the New Jersey Sierra Club. We work with labor, faith-based groups as part of New Jersey Windworks. And so we really had this strategy to try to spread the message far and wide. And one of the questions that I, sort of posed in the beginning of this was, where was this information coming from? Why did all of a sudden, whales become the hot topic for offshore wind? And so if you follow the story, a lot of this quote unquote grassroots opposition is funded by out-of-state fossil fuels. And you don't have to take my word for it. It's pretty public. The Caesar Rodney Institute out of Delaware is a conservative think tank that has fossil fuel funding and interests. There are other organizations out of state that basically funded misinformation campaigns to go into communities to tell them that it was killing whales. You know, we've seen in other places, it sort of seemed like a spaghetti at the wall, where it was like, well, we can say that offshore wind's going to kill your property values. We can say that offshore wind is going to destroy fishing. We can say all these things, but the message that stuck when they hit offshore wind is killing whales, that's the one that took off. And so all of the funding went into that offshore wind is killing whales. And so, you know, we did a very, like I said, a pretty aggressive media tour on it. And so here's just some quotes from some of the places. Now, again, it became an international story, frankly. One of the things that this helped us, though, get out to people is if you are really interested in protecting the whales, in addition to combating climate change, we can talk about how to reduce vessel speed restrictions. There is policy that we can enact that will protect whales from vessel speed strikes, excuse me, and that's speed restriction, vessel speed restrictions, excuse me. And so NOAA had rules up for comment about vessel speed restrictions. And so we mobilized our activists and we advocated for them because we said, you're exactly right. We should protect the whales. And one of the ways we can do that is slow down boats so that we could minimize vessel strikes because the whales would have, you know, basically the boats would have enough time to slow down. If you see a protected species, which not only humpback whales, but we have North Atlantic right whales, which are critically endangered operating in this area. So we emphasize our point again, we stuck to our talking points that the #1 threat to our oceans and all of our marine ecosystems is climate change, and that there are policy decisions we can make to protect them, including, like I said, you know, addressing climate change through a just, equitable transition to clean energy, but also by reducing vessel speed restrictions. And I talked about the funded misinformation campaigns, and I will say this isn't the end of it. We're now seeing a lot of misinformation coming around transmission, as Captain Paul said, like there's, you know, EMF and this and that and the other thing that doesn't really have evidence in the science. And again, some people have genuine questions, and we should always ask those questions on these projects. We should think critically about our environmental work. But it is also important to recognize the hallmarks of what is funded misinformation or just climate misinformation. And so Brown University did a study, and they had compiled a lot of other, there's a citation at the bottom there, a lot of other resources on climate misinformation specifically, and some of the tactics that you'll see. So the first one that you'll see is whataboutism, individualism, free rider, things like, well, if China's not addressing emissions, why should we? Or, well, what about, you know, solar? What about nuclear? Why does it have to be offshore wind? Things like that. And we've always been very clear that there is no source of energy at all that has zero impact. There's not. Anything that we do is going to have some impacts, but it's how do we develop responsibly, sustainably, and ethically. And for us, that's clean, renewable. That's developed, again, in a responsible manner towards our environment. So there's some other just hallmarks here of misinformation, that we can't do anything, it doesn't matter, we shouldn't do it anyway, that one we see a lot is that the policy is not perfect, so we shouldn't do it at all. But again, we know that the alternative is fossil fuels, and we know the effects of fossil fuels on our air quality, our climate, public health, etc. Some other hallmarks of misinformation, just things to look at. Cherry picking was a big one here in terms of stranding events, because there was a lot of data that showed that there were strandings when there was no work happening offshore, and when there was work, there were no strandings, but nobody talked about those data points, right? So picking those examples that only support the misinformation. And then we did see, unfortunately, some conspiracy theories, things like that. So just things to keep an eye out for in terms of a funded misinformation campaign. And so we still do this work. It wasn't a one and done situation for us. So we're still advocating for vessel speed restrictions. We're still advocating and educating on responsibly developed offshore wind. We have a number of active lease areas offshore the coast of New Jersey. If you're interested in learning more about New Jersey Windworks or about the work that we're doing at the League of Conservation Voters in New Jersey, there's some information, and you can also always reach us at our email, information@njlcv.org. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we experienced in New Jersey.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all three of you for your great presentations. We're going to move into Q&A. We have some questions in the chat. We have two addressing birds. If someone can address the impact of offshore wind farms on migratory and non-migratory birds, and what about bird strikes with the turbines? Is it related to the color of the blades? So kind of a double whammy question, but both on birds. Someone wants to tackle that one.
I can do a little, unless Captain Paul, there's anything you want to say before I jump in.
Well, I can tell you that in the designing of the placement of the wind farms along our coast, they used heat maps and radar images from past migration patterns, and all of the wind farms that are off of New Jersey are actually outside what we call the Atlantic Flyway. So anything pretty much past the 8-mile mark is a safe zone. Not sure if anybody here on this call remembers, but about a decade ago, New Jersey tried to put turbines in at 2.8 miles off the coast. And because we believe in responsible placement of renewable energy and offshore wind, we fought against this. We said, hey, you can put it in, but you just need to go further off. You need to go further outside because it was directly in the flight path. And so moving forward, I know that there has been some studies done on putting stripes and different colors and light and sound devices on blades, not only for bats, but excuse me, not only for birds, but for bats too. Go ahead, Allison. I hope that helped.
Yeah, no, that was a lot of what I was going to say in terms of location, and you talked about disruptive painting, things like that. The only other thing I will add is that any of these projects go through rigorous environmental review for impacts on all protected species and on the environment through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They do a federal review called an environmental impact statement. Those are all public documents and they are open for comment. And so if you are interested in projects in Connecticut or elsewhere, I would encourage you to look for those documents, to read them, see what potential impacts could be. And as Captain Paul said, advocate for the most protective, most responsible development that you can. But those impacts are publicly shared well before projects are ever constructed.
Great, thank you. And this next question I think is going to be for Charles. Someone was asking about tidal energy and if it's ever been considered for Connecticut.
I am no expert when it comes to tidal energy. My recollection is that there have been some small pilot scale projects proposed from time to time. I don't believe any of them have actually been implemented to date, but folks have discussed it, looked at some areas, particularly the race has some really good currents for generating some electricity from those currents. So yeah, I think folks have speculated and sort of dipped their toes into it, but I'm not aware of any actual projects. But Captain Paul, it looks like you were nodding along, so hopefully I got that right.
Yeah, I think the Long Island Sound has very limited application. I know they tried several attempts in the East River where we have really, really strong currents, and they put smaller turbines underwater that turned with the tides. And yes, they do generate. However, there is a chance of sea marine life getting harmed. I don't know why it didn't take off. I know along our coast there have been some concepts that work on wave action, but we just don't have those waves in the Long Island Sound that you would need to push a plunger type device to generate electricity from. So, but I'm sure that somebody's working on a better mousetrap out there that will eventually. But offshore wind is what we have now. It's clearly the most everything in renewable energy, as you know, works on efficiency. So if a solar panel, the best solar panel around is at 22% efficiency, a land-based turbine may be at 30%. Well, an offshore wind turbine is over 50%. So that means that it's making the most or more energy, more clean energy for the least amount of money. So that's why we're moving ahead with this. I don't know if that helped, Charles.
Yeah, no, thank you for that additional information. That's great. I'd forgotten about the East River.
Yeah, as it screams through there, so it'd be an ideal spot for that. And I think it was powering like a couple of grocery stores or something for a while, which is pretty cool. I don't know if I'd want to swim through a 12-foot tall turbine on the bottom of the East River, but okay.
So thank you for that. I got this one sent to me. How do offshore wind farms contribute to the local economy? And I've seen that there have been misconceptions that they don't provide substantial economic benefits. If anyone wants to answer that one.
Yeah, I'll start. And again, I'll refer back to all of the activity that's happening at the Port of New London right now. That was the staging area for the South Fork, New York wind project, which is completed. And it's now the staging area for Revolution Wind, the joint Connecticut-Rhode Island project. I don't have the statistics right at my fingertips, but it is a hub of activity. You only have to talk to Mayor Pissarro of New London to hear how beneficial it's been for the local economy there. It is driving jobs and economic activity. Hopefully proposed plans to develop a staging area in Bridgeport will also come to fruition. As I mentioned, that had been part of the postponed Park City Wind, which is now called New England Wind 1. For those of you that are keeping score at home, the developers are constantly changing the names of these projects. So that ran into a little bit of a snag when the site was partially rezoned by the city of Bridgeport. So it wasn't, it was no longer zoned for the sort of light industrial activity that was considered. But Park City Wind still anticipated having administration and O&M offices there. So we will see, but New London in particular is really developing as a key player in this segment. Once Revolution Wind is completed, there's at least one of the current projects that are under bid that is also proposing to use New London as that site. So we see that site continuing this work and growing over time for years to come.
And I can just quickly add in New Jersey, we work with labor as part of New Jersey WindWorks, who have been very supportive for the creation of jobs. The New Jersey Wind Port in South Jersey alone is estimated to create 1,500 long-term jobs, in addition to hundreds of union construction jobs. There's been, commitments that offshore wind will be created with family-sustaining union wages. And it's estimated that that wind port alone, which is a construction manufacturing hub for offshore wind down in South Jersey, will have a regional impact of about $500 million to the local and statewide economy. So, so good things there as well.
Great, thank you. I have one last question, which is perfect because we're right at time. This one I think is targeted for you, Charles. So what are the biggest misconceptions that people are talking about in Connecticut right now? Is it the blade failure, or is it something else that Connecticut people should be aware of?
Certainly folks in Connecticut are aware of the blade failure, even though there hasn't been really any direct impact here in Connecticut. In many ways, we have been fortunate in avoiding the sort of knee-jerk opposition to these projects that you've seen in some areas, particularly in Massachusetts. Whether that's because to date there hasn't been any sort of real physical tie to the projects. I mentioned there haven't been any onshore substations proposed in Connecticut to service these projects. They're mostly the power being transmitted through other states. That being said, I think there are some people trying to make a lot of hay about the recent rate increases here in Connecticut and trying to advance the false narrative that clean renewable energy is too expensive and we simply can't afford it. And in fact, there's been a lot of great analysis showing how investments in clean renewable energy can actually drive down electricity rates. It really helps to combat the sort of mercy that ratepayers are at when it comes to the volatility of sources like natural gas. And as I mentioned, the most recent increase really has absolutely nothing to do with our investments in clean renewable energy, whether that's solar or offshore wind. Although, again, people are trying to suggest that. It's really driven by our contracts with the legacy generator Millstone, as well as some COVID-related arrearages. So I think those cost concerns, as specious as they are going to be the item that we really need to address and that we'll be hearing the most about.
Great, awesome. We are at time, so I wanted to end on a good note. And thank you all so much for your presentations. It was really helpful, and I hope people got a lot out of it. This is recorded, and we're gonna send out a video to everyone who registered through the link, and we're gonna put it up on our YouTube channel as well. So I'm gonna have stop recording, and then we're gonna hop off